The European Union has been coming up with a lot of regulations lately. We have NIS2 coming, and with it, the Cybersecurity Implementation Act. On top of this regulation, we have, for example, the implementing regulation, and this implementing regulation for certain digital services introduces the obligation to screen employees or to ensure the security of human resources. The NIS2 directive or the forthcoming law on cybersecurity are also working with the concept of human resources security. In addition, there is the Critical Infrastructure Act, which also addresses the issue of human resources security. It deals with it in considerable detail, introducing the obligation to vet applicants and to verify them, including impunity and so on. And all of these new regulations show that we're changing a little bit the perception of the concept of that, of what human resource security means, where I feel a little bit that some of these regulations, or people even in the Czech Republic, even in Europe, have it in their heads that human resource security means training. And for that reason, I have invited Petr Moroz to the podcast today, the founder of Scout.com, which is a screening and background check company. We're going to get 100% into what it all means. And I welcome you here, Petr. Hi, Petr.
Hi, hello.
And I'm going to start with something I've mentioned a couple of times here. That is human resource security. And I'm wondering what it means to you when you say that a company has to deal with human resource security.
Wow, security. I'm afraid I should probably start with what it's not rather than what it is, because the general perception of the world, at least in this country and in surrounding states, probably the former post-Soviet Union, is that it's a lustration or a vetting, that it's some kind of spying and snooping on people who come to me somewhere, rather than the other way around. I know who I'm working with, I know who I'm trusting with personal information, I know who I'm trusting with client data, I know who I'm sending my computer to because they're going to be working remote. And that's security for me. It's that I'm ensuring the security of my data, my assets, my client information, and in fact the rest of my staff. Because I need to know who I have in that company and that I hired them based on complete and true information.
And what do you see as the biggest risk with, say, new people coming in? What would you perceive as some red flags, for example, of that person coming in? So what should those companies be looking out for with those people coming in?
I think that's where it's important to say that every company and every position is different. That said, there is no one ultimate muster for this. This is screening and this is not screening. If I go over it, I would expect a lawyer to have passed the bar exam. I would expect a doctor to be board certified and maybe for the specific work they do. For a regulated position, say a financial advisor, it would be different. You mentioned the Critical Infrastructure Act. It says, for example, that the minimum is to verify identity and verify non-presence. And that, by the way, is for every employee, or rather, in the Czech law, is even an employee, which is an employee or an individual entrepreneur. And that's both the critical infrastructure entity itself and its contractor. So there we have the supply chain. That big supply chain, or that chain of functions. And then we have to go back to what is that identity. For example, do I verify the documents? Do I have to make a copy or do I not have to make a copy? Do I verify them in the invalid document database, or do I verify in the population database that the person really exists? Because if I made up a document, his number wouldn't be in the invalid document database because there's no valid ones or anything like that. So every company, each position is specific, and that company would actually, before they even apply any screening, they should think about risk analysis, categorizing the jobs and mapping out the screening process.
I think you're leading me straight to the next question. Because that risk analysis, if the company should be thinking about, and you've already mentioned it here, the document number, if I give it, like, I'll make it up and it won't be in the invalid document database. I think, and that's where I was directing them, that's where my previous question is. So I'm going to direct you there now, that a lot of companies and people, even like me, before I met you, I'll admit, even for me, security resources were still kind of boxed in really in that training. I was like, okay, so like actually what more should the staff do with it? Until I like figured out what all like could happen. And if you could give some like more specific guidance or like a specific use case of what all those companies should analyze as that risk. What all can actually happen, what all maybe the candidate can like come up with that's wrong, or what all that employee can like do to me and related to that. what I should check, because I think the companies are implying that they don't know what I should check his education. I should check his criminal record, because I think the companies are implying that they don't know what I should check his education. I should check his criminal record. But even if I do that, why do I have to do it? What can happen to me? Could you try this in some one-box answers?
I don't know if that's going to work in one box exactly, but I might start with a different concept, and that's the triangle of deception, which that Donald Cressy came up with somewhere, I think, in the 1970s, who mapped out why people cheat or why they commit unethical acts. And he actually came up with the concept of the triangle of deception, which says, in order to cheat, there are 3 parameters or 3 criteria that must be met: motivation, justification, and pressure. Opportunity, sorry. So pressure, justification, and opportunity. And pressure is what it's all about. I can't make my mortgage payments, a foreclosure coming to foreclose on my house, or something like that. The opportunity is about those control processes, and the justification is the tone from the top. Managers are still getting bonuses paid, even though blue collars are getting laid off and things like that. And you have to look at it from that perspective. The company needs to know what threats it faces, and they often don't know that, and that's the problem. And then I might come back to who is the typical user or client for screening, because those companies often know what the threats are. That's theft, industrial espionage, data loss, ransomware, some cyber attacks. And then the source, and that can be an external entity, an internal employee, somebody working together, that sort of thing. If I hire a person who's not honest and who's directly motivated to make a buck, then, of course, the risk to me increases significantly and the threat is still the same. He can use that data for any purpose. After all, in the Czech Republic, we have X cases historically where no one has abused access to client databases, like in telecommunications or somewhere else, or in financial consulting, which they then monetized because he has access to them. The pressure is there. He needs to sort out, and it could be drug addiction, it could be anything. After all, when I worked in banking for many years, most of the staff we caught in internal fraud were older ladies who had a junkie son at home, a gambling husband trying to keep the family together. And it starts with a little, she's got opportunity, she's working with cash. The bank doesn't check it, and it starts with 1 penny, then it starts with 1,000. Then it gets into this spiral where there's no way out. And it's up to the company to set those measures and know not only who they're letting in, but then to continually assess whether that person is still under any kind of financial pressure. Just being forced to behave in a way that they wouldn't normally behave. By the way, the other concept that I often lecture about, for example, at the CE and so on, is the former CIA director or FBI, I don't know now, Edgar J. Hoover, who came up with the concept or the idea that people can generally be categorized into 3 groups. 25% are always honest. They got it from home, from school, from church. They're just the ones that are always honest, like Mirek Dusin. He's always going to be honest. 25% will always be motivated to somehow better themselves at someone else's expense. He'll cheat at school. He'll cheat at sports. He'll outperform. Just always looking for that shortcut to get better. And 50% of them will just behave the way they're supposed to. And when you think about the other things in compliance, you have whistleblowing, which does what? For the 2 groups to be able to tell the 3rd group that there's something going on. Speak up, right, by default, that we want to draw attention to something. Screening, it's a purposeful way for us to use the red, the 25, not to let them into the company at all. They're carrying it around. They've acted that way elsewhere. There's already a pattern of behavior there. And very likely, if we focus on them a little bit, how do we find it? Or at least reduce the risk of letting those 25 in. Then we have the tone from above and so on. Those are the codes of ethics and so forth. Compliance, training, awareness, and those affect the other 50. This is what we expect from you. So she's not a fag. He's all a living organism. That's a puzzle. It's individual pieces that work together. And if I take one out, it doesn't stop working. But it works significantly less.
I like stories. I love stories, And I think that as people in general, we like stories. You could try to give us a real use case that you've dealt with, like when I've heard a few of them about you. I'll admit I've listened to a few. Really a sample of that, of what the 25% of the red ones that I don't really want in there might look like, what they're capable of, how they want to get into those companies, really like with the intent that they're just going to do harm. We know that from the IT world, for example. I know clients myself who have been burned on that. They just hired a developer somewhere in Romania, and he worked there for 3 months, but he didn't actually do it. It was just some guy who didn't do anything for those 3 months, and then there was just a huge financial loss. Can you try to give us a concrete example of how, for example, the attackers, I'll call them attackers, how they work, what they do, what are the options, what are the things that can be done today? That's it.
There's a lot of them. We'd be here for a long time, or we'd have a podcast to go on. But there's one probably significantly publicized one that we've talked about a lot. And ironically, it's the one that has the biggest impact on a lot of companies that don't even realize it. Ultimately, he impacts all of us, and I'll get to why. And actually, there's been a huge increase in these cases recently. Let's say in the last 3-4 years has come with COVID, has come with people moving to remote working or telecommuting and remote recruitment, where actually people have stopped meeting, and we were the first company in Europe, for example, to highlight, and then in collaboration with CT24 to publicize the case of the North Korean hackers. It's an organized pro-government group that very few people know about, or very few people maybe realize. Fun fact, the North Korean government makes most of its budget money from ransomware and malware attacks. Organized cybercrime, which if any of us have read in the last year, 2, 3, any news about this hospital disconnected from the grid, this manufacturing disconnected from the grid, etc., it's not necessarily about that. That a person or a group somewhere is remotely trying to infiltrate, say, Brno Hospital or Berun Hospital or Prague Hospital. It doesn't matter. It's usually either a targeted attack in the sense of we know where, we know why, and now, but we usually need someone on the inside to help us. And the way is either way. So it used to be that we were looking for a way to find somebody that we could blackmail and force them, give us the keys or let us in. The way it works today is that a much easier way is to use a fictitious or made-up identity, or even steal it from someone that is an existing identity, set up on platforms like Rule.io, which is an Estonian standard startup company, or a startup. Probably not really a startup anymore, where I first create an identity or steal Jurka Hradsky here. I know some basic information about you, which is that you're in business, so I know where you live, etc. So it's not that hard to piece together the data, even if I have some database leaks and stuff. This is a specific example, but not related to you. The second thing I'll do is I'll create the documents, which if someone of average intelligence can Google, maybe not even Google nowadays, but you ask ChatGPT, and we've seen several cases over the last while, where even with these AI tools, you can generate documents that are photorealistic, look like a real document. So I have a receipt, I sign up for a platform like Rule, and I register. I create a freelance account, and they'll invoice some other third party for me. That is, they're going to do the financial collection for me. I'll find a job agency in the Czech Republic. Or the organized group typically works by having crawlers that constantly identify opportunities on LinkedIn, where the company says, hey, we're looking for this typical position. They know exactly the types of positions that are specific to the fact that they're probably going to have access to a date, meaning a full stack developer and a database scientist and things like that. That's what they'll adjust the LinkedIn profiles they already have. They have thousands of those. Fake photos or photos of a bank somewhere. Or today again would be made up of AI generated with all the story around that. They'd edit the lyrics, apply for the position, get an interview. They go through that interview. Until recently, for example, even with an Asian background, they would say, hey, I'm Estonian, second generation. It's, after all, Vietnamese in the Czech Republic. It's going to be exactly the same thing. You're not going to make it for some reason. And you shouldn't even have to. You shouldn't question it for some reason. You'll say, great, a very qualified person, very good interview, perfect. Where do we send your computer? And usually it's Serbia or it's Bulgaria or it's something like that. And there's a dead box, though, where just the computer comes in, the computer gets forwarded on, and the person, this is a specific, we've had 2 cases where at the same time, the same person, once under a Slovak identity, once under an Estonian or Danish identity, and that's in that report on CT24, which everyone can trace. They tried to infiltrate Czech startups, technological, very advanced startups, but they were providing the types of products and services that if someone attacked and deliberately left a backdoor or information, they could actually, let's say, spy on a fairly large portion of the clientele. Okay, and now we're in the second phase. We published a report on this. We even published a whole bunch of companies that we knew that may have come into contact with this person because we knew who was following him on LinkedIn, who was connected to him, and so on. As we reported, well, about a year later, we got word that the agency had supplied him anyway for 6 months to a large multinational tech company in Brno, of all places. And there for 6 months, he did work just invoiced through Rule. And what happened after that, it's hard to say. Because he left a back door, or took client data, or damaged something, or got into the source code. There are a lot of cases like that. And he's not very aware of it. How many people are in the supply chain, or involved in the supply chain of companies like banks? A bank may have, by the way, one of the Czech banks is the largest IT developer in the Czech Republic. Almost, if you take it on the number of people and on that monetary value, how much they make. But let's say they have, for example, I don't know, 2,000 developers. And those 2,000 developers will be outsourced somewhere. They're not core employees. They're not core employees. And the fact that I said to company A, deliver me 3 people or 20 people, doesn't mean that company A has followed any basic ethical or hygienic hiring rules that meet my standards. And I think that's the problem, the chaining of it. I call it the law of diminishing responsibility, but that's what it is. And that's the problem we're getting into. Everybody takes it that one level further. But on the client who has that data in there, who has their personal information in there, who has their banking information in there, and now it's not about the banks at all. It could be about any entity. It's the same way he gets access to x-rays, medical records. That's just a big deal. Unless some basic hygiene is practiced.
Actually, you're kind of leading me a little bit into the next topic, which we're kind of smoothly moving into, and that's the issue of contractors. For example, in the current legislation that's coming at us, as I mentioned, NIS2, or the Cybersecurity Act, is, first of all, a very controversial subject that is being very much debated. That is how to manage suppliers, how, for example, the state can ban certain suppliers and so on. And at the same time, there are rules for what all those contractors have to do, even maybe some question of controlling those contractors and some vetting. On the other hand, for example, as I've mentioned here, the human resource security is never in those regulations. I'll take it now specifically on the draft cybersecurity decree, both for the lower duty, higher duty regime, where really human resource management means I have to prove that I've trained those employees. And I'm directing that question to, how do you assess the current legislative state that we have here in this area? How do you perceive it? Don't be polite, just tell us.
Don't be polite, just give us a name. I believe, and maybe I believe because I heard it somewhere, that the specific screening requirements didn't make it into the bill because it would have complicated the approval process. Maybe it will get on some ordinances, in some kind of implementation documents or something like that. In contrast, for example, the Ministry of the Interior and actually the Fire Service, who are the guarantors of the Critical Infrastructure Act, have really taken the CER directive, Critical Entities Resilience Directive, which is the basis of the law, and they took a one-to-one. This is what the directive wants. We put this in the law, and bye-bye. And there's not going to be any discussion about whether or not giving up is okay, because the directive is clear, it's valid, and it's the default. So either we have to define it precisely, or if we don't define it, then we're going to be chasing after it anyway. Well, how do we want it, and how do we enforce it? And then the arguments will come. I'm sick of it for one reason. The client generally won't do anything that the law doesn't require them to do. If it's not on paper, nobody can ask me to do it. That's one thing. But at that point, we're setting ourselves up for an even bigger problem. We've never been fined for this, and those are probably the most common arguments for it. Why not? On the other hand, then I perceive, but anyway, if the Czech company is going to, say, do business abroad, sell to a German or a Swedish or a Finnish or a French company, then the directive is valid there too. And if that entity wants to operate there, it will have to prove it anyway, or can be fairly required to prove that they've done the screening or any other activity. So I think that the Czech legislator or the author of the law has not made things any easier for himself, because he has actually created a bigger problem for companies just by doing that, by thinking that alibistically it's just going to make it easier. But I don't want to offend anyone. That's the way it is, and I deliberately don't want to comment on politics.
Maybe I would add to that so that we don't shoot unnecessarily now somewhere where maybe it wasn't meant to be. Because actually, the implementing ones, when I mentioned the decrees, he and NUKIB itself, who is the author of the bill, he actually states that he has prepared the decrees so that the legislative process can be started. That is, so that they can send the law. That is, it is still a working version. It's still starting that process now of where those ordinances are going to go through that wheel, that they're actually going to be edited into that final form, even in light of the fact that there's that NISCA implementing regulation just for cloud computing and some of the other digital services, which deals with human resources security. They also deal with it in general terms in the implementing regulation. When they say they should have those obligated entities verify the reliability of those employees, they don't go to bidders, they go to employee background checks, and they actually refer to the way they verify their contractors. That's how I should be verifying my employees, under the specified assets. So basically, I'm kind of still secretly hoping that even in finalizing that ordinance, it's still like reflected in that implementing ordinance in our ordinance. So maybe we'll get it in there, because I really think is, after having talked to you a couple of times already, that's like really a problem. And it's not like it's a problem that only you would tell me. I've experienced it and dealt with it with clients, where really that use case of when I'm recruiting remotely, and especially when it's a digital service where I just have a developer, I have some developers that I don't see at all. I never need to see them. And the fact that they're like coding somewhere, I don't need to be there. So it just really like problems. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be some infiltration that's the target. It can just be the traffic just being easy money for me, like for the attacker, that I just get money from the company. And I'm not going to be there for like 3 months, and then I'm going to get fired, and then they're going to find me, and then they're going to find me. So I still believe we're going to get there, that it's going to work. And the Critical Infrastructure Act works pretty well with it. And there's one other thing that's related to that law, and that's also something that we've dealt with together in the past, and that's the question of, on the one hand, the customers, and your customers are often in the position that if the law doesn't tell me to, I'm not going to do it. I'm dealing with that myself. Like, setting up compliance in companies is just about exactly that. Like, where the law doesn't tell me to, I'm not going to do it there. I'm going to do it where I'm really facing the biggest penalties. I still want to hear the gradation of those penalties. So where the penalty is the smallest, I'm not going to deal with that either. But there's the other side of it, and that's that. I can imagine those customers getting into a situation where they say they can't do it because maybe the law forbids them to do it. Are you experiencing that?
Probably more often than I should or would like to. Again, there are two ways of looking at it, and I'm just going to go back briefly to the law or the implementation documentation. It would be quite sufficient to refer to guidelines or standards that are already in place, such as ISO 27002, which, by the way, clearly specifies how the screening should be carried out. That is, you have an identity, you have an education, professional history, the debt-free or extortionate nature of the person, etc. We don't have to create anything new. It's been around for like a long time. It just needs to be referenced. But it is, if we get to the GDPR issue or roadblocks in general, I think it's twofold. And it has to do with just the misunderstanding of what screening is. And it's unfortunately being the only company in the market that's doing it, or one of the few, it's very difficult, or it creates the complexity that actually the education and the outreach is more complex and it's longer. Because no, the listener always finds it. So I'll give one example and I'll look at it from two perspectives. One will be the HR person, one will be the CISO. I need to do the screening. Some legislation tells me to do it, or some regulation tells me to do it, or it's just mandated by my mother. You should know who you're hiring. Typical argument with a recruiter, which to me is a user of those services, but not the decision maker. Yes, we want to do that. He's either going to say, we've been doing that for a long time. However, we're breaking more regulations with that than we are today. Because then if you ask, and then how do you get to the most criminal records? Well, that's what the candidate will bring us. And where? Well, that's in the drawer over there. Or we scanned it, or no archiving, no securing that information. By the way, it doesn't even address whether there are any relevant crimes and non-relevant crimes anymore, but they see everything. They can then say, hey, we were nonpartisan and we really only considered the relevant ones, which on the other hand, with screening in place, they would know. Because they don't get to them, there's actually a masking of information and they don't get to it. What's not relevant and so on. So a common argument is you can't do that. We're not allowed to do that under GDPR. We're not allowed to ask about it at all. We're not allowed to work with the date of birth because we would know how old that person is. So that's probably the most common argument against it. The one where the person who knows what they're talking about is relevant is probably the most common one for me lately is CISO. Because they know what the applicable guidelines are. They know what the risks are. He's usually assessed them, knows what the penalties are. So for me, that makes him like the best partner in that company. But still, most of the time you'll run into that HR that will say, no way. That's going to prolong our recruiting. The candidates would go somewhere else.
I run into that the same way, and it doesn't even have to be HR. I encounter it with lawyers as well. And there I often see it as maybe the easiest way to cut a case that nobody really wants to do. That it's a subject that requires a little bit of creative thinking. I don't want to pick on anybody, of course, or anything like that, but it happens sometimes. The easiest way out is to say, oh, I can't do it. It just doesn't hurt. And I'm that kind of person who fights me terribly for knowing when somebody says, for example, this is what GDPR forbids. I really don't like it when somebody says, you can't do that because GDPR says you can't. And I always ask everybody to show me where GDPR says no. Of course there are, whether we're talking about the criminal history, for example, but again, this has some solutions too. We have like a lot of regulations here that set the rules. And unfortunately, even those recruiters often, and I come across this, they think of it as the opposite. They just set, like you mentioned, date of birth, age, galos can't, but it's a little bit different when they think about it. It should be. Say to yourself why, and then say to yourself because, and can I do this because of that? And then think about what the scope of the data or information is there. If I have some justifiable legality because of that, then I can just do it. And that's how you have to think about the screening too. I'm bringing this up because, first of all, we're on a legal podcast. Secondly, we've addressed this together with clients and your customers a couple of times from the question of this, when it is and isn't possible. And so I have to give you credit for that. At the moment, there are like CISOs or somebody who knows the purpose, meaning like they're not just thinking about the factual, the activity of what's going to be done, but like they know why it's going to be done. So all of a sudden, the blocker is like not there after all. Absolutely.
It's a paradox that, and I see it with the clients and the HR people in the final, with the users, Scott, for example, that the moment the process gets going and they start to use it, they say never again. Because it will make it easier, faster, better for them. Whether it's the collection of the information, the evaluation of the information, the fact that suddenly they don't have to worry about where do we have the data. The other nice example of this is, for example, extended creditworthiness, or say some bank and non-bank registers. Because again, few people are aware, at least on the user side, that they're not allowed to look at the bank register or a report from a bank register, the positive data, but they are there. You can't avoid them. Unless you have that Chinese wall between you again, only the negative information that's relevant gets to me so that I know. that I can't employ that person in the financial market, but how do I make sure that the recruiter doesn't see the positive ones and go, 3 mortgages and 80 grand in repayments? Sorry, you just can't defend that. And just like someone with a criminal record for not paying child support. Well, something like that doesn't make him a bad person. Drunk driving probably doesn't either. Although now someone's gotten away with it in a state or city job bid, but you know where I'm going. Just as long as it's not relevant to me, it's none of my business. And the irony is I respect it more than the final user who says, well, no way, that's not an option. But it's a point of view.
Well, it is, and that's actually why I'm glad we're having this podcast today, this conversation, because it's exactly like outlining to these people the why it should be done. Even the exact example that you said that was also on the Czech TV, it's just like that exact realization that I'm actually doing it for a purpose, and the moment I know the why, then even if I can imagine that I would have written some documentation within some management system where I would write down what crimes I will judge. I won't. So the moment I know the why, I'll be able to distinguish, right? That if I'm concerned about that, and within my code of ethics, for example, I have set that the fight against bribery or like accepting a bribe or any similar act, well, clearly then I won't be interested in those employees now. For example, these family crimes that are related to that. Of course, if there's a murder, I guess I'll still be interested. I can imagine the other side of it, and can the person compartmentalize it? We're kind of getting into what Scout is actually doing. Can he introduce him to us?
Have you ever hired a man that you regretted doing?
We're taping it, so I'll say yes.
So we're helping you do that, or we're helping clients do it, to keep that risk to a minimum? In a nutshell, SCOT is short for screening machine, or screening automated if we're going abroad, but it was created as a check robot, as a screening automaton. Practically, it's a platform that's online, that the client can access. They can set it up themselves and enter a person, choose the type of screening. That is the range, either a package or just a single thing, individual verification. And the machine will do that either automated or with some semi-manual process. That is, if there's some human intervention somewhere, somebody in Scout will do it. We interact with the candidate. That is, the candidate gets the invitation, fills in the data, or vice versa. It's retrieved from LinkedIn with their consent. He actually does everything in the candidate platform, which can be white labeled and so on, and that's like the unimportant thing. So he's providing information from one place, period, signature, electronically, just on a spreadsheet or on a mobile phone or a mouse. And that's the end of it for him. And what I always say, what Scout is versus what it's not. SCOT is fact-checking. The input and output of the data either matches, then the result is green, self-photo clear, or yellow, no match, or there's something that's a match to some of my risk criteria, and then it's consider. Consider means you, the user, consider how this impacts you as a company. There's no red flag, there's no recommendation, there's no assumption we're not evaluating anybody, but the machine returns clear consider. And it can be, as I say, as simple a thing as identifying a client or a candidate. I mean, we have clients even at the level of, say, for example, real estate agents who just need to verify the identity and identify the client. We are used by some companies at the front desk where they just clean enter over the first name, last name, date of birth from the person's documents, verify databases, searches, or some sanction lists. We are used by clients for top management positions, really for vice presidents, presidents of large international organizations. So the scope is diverse. Of course, even the functionalities for that are then tailored from corporate large clients who can share those reports amongst themselves. By the way, that's probably the most interesting aspect just from the point of view of, for example, the new legislation. I, as a user, do not necessarily have to pay for the screening, but I can demand it from my supplier, or I can have it in the terms and conditions. a big energy company, I can have it in my terms and conditions, whereas we're a critical infrastructure. Everybody who supplies people to us and enters our operation has to meet the same legislative obligation that we do. We certainly don't pay for them. They are your employees. But you'll prove to us that they've been through the same level of vetting as we have. That is, either there is an Energos package that we want you to order from Scout and share the report with us through Scout, which again is massaged at the personal data level just on what's relevant. That is, does that result see green, and who it was on? They can verify maybe through a QR code or through another link that that's actually the case, or they've actually shared those people into a database. That is, they can look at any time, yes, these are the people. They can share it with the state through the API and so on. Well, or I use it myself as a small business. We have, let's say, probably a larger number of those. And these are single onboarding, where just one onboarding me, I know I'm going to let him access the cash, or he's going to control the bank account. And so I'll do maybe just that basic credit check, or whatever it's called, where we have maybe just bankruptcies, foreclosures, and some public debts. That is, I don't need the candidate's participation. I have a vested interest, the data I need for that: first name, last name, date of birth. So I'll tap. There may be 1,000. I can go mass entry, or I can be one. I can name, last name, date of birth. So I tap. There may be 1,000. I do mass entry, or there may be one. I do one. I have the screening done in a few seconds, and I can move on with it. So the level of that usage is varied. The level of service is absolutely customizable by that particular client, and actually the workflows behind that. So far, it's actually more, I would say today, we're an automation or orchestration platform of individual workflows. We involve a lot of third parties. We cover 160 countries around the world. So the Czech Republic is about as big for us as it is globally. Although we have a lot of clients here, however, most of the candidates today are foreign candidates. And it's also about being multilingual. We have to support individual states. Maybe we pride ourselves on being the only screening agency in the world today that can perform a criminal background check in any state of the European Union without a certified power of attorney. This means that a candidate can give us consent electronically within Scout as a platform. And we are able to verify, for example, from Germany, a criminal record or a criminal record within the second or third day, which in Germany itself takes a week. So just like that. So it's a lot about how we do it. It's about how long we've been creating these different workflows and actually the logic behind it, and how we put the technology blocks together to get that technological edge.
You also mentioned that part of those processes or services are also related to the direct involvement of those candidates in some of the candidate part, where they, and I understand that, not all the information I get without having some interaction from that candidate. How do those candidates perceive that? Because we've been talking about these companies all along now, but how do they feel about being subjected to that screening, that background check? What kind of feedback do you get from them, for example?
It's not just about that they have to participate, because for us to get some information, but it's just about, like I said, first of all, we care to verify completeness and veracity. Not that we're finding out anything beyond what the person has said. So he's a big difference between a search that we don't do and fact-checking. So we, on the other hand, prefer from clients, and we teach clients, or we encourage clients to include that candidate in that process. Of course, identity and things like that, I guess that's how it depends. If I just want to verify, for example, identity against the civil registry, they can do that if I know the type of documents, the document number, first name, last name, date of birth. And again, the client has to show us that legal interest, but they can do this check and they know in a second. Yes, the person exists in the database. It's okay, and he doesn't have to show the documents. Again, we're at GDPR. Candidate. There are units of case a year out of thousands. We've got about 3,800 screenings in the first quarter, so those screenings are really like thousands to tens of thousands a year, depending on whether it's COVID or not. It's units where we learn. And of course, we don't necessarily always know, but we learn that, as they say, the candidate is dragging his heels and radically says no. And I always say, the shaken goose poops the most, or not poops, but poops the most. And I've always gotten confirmation from the client so far, even though they've taken the candidate afterwards, I would say, but he's great. He doesn't agree with it. We're actually going to do it differently. He's always ended up in probation. They've always said, wow, we're such jerks. Why did we do that? Most of the time it's to do with a bad reference, previous employment or something like that. It breaks up the team. Other people leave because of it. Then he says, yeah, we really shouldn't have done that. It doesn't always have to be that way. We, on the other hand, often say to clients, if you don't want to do a specific part of it, bring the documents yourself. But again, you have procedures to check. Or somebody may just say, look, I don't want a Scot representing me under a power of attorney. Do it another way, or have him bring it in himself. Well, of course, that's an option, but whoever's clucking the loudest is usually in trouble. On the other hand, I think it can act as a very positive defensive deterrent. And somebody very close to me recently compared it to an avenue like that in New York, full of very exclusive nightclubs, which are the businesses that those clients go to or those candidates go to. And the better clubs have that bouncer, the bouncer in front of the club who makes the decisions, who gets in, who doesn't get in. That's the screening company. And the one company that says, poof, we don't need anything like that, that's where all the scrubs meet. That didn't get into the other ones. And it works really well. And so it depends. On the other hand, it has to be said that it's about communication and it's about transparency. And there's nothing worse for me than in the recruitment process or in the selection process. At the end, someone says, hey, there's one more bit of badgering from security. You're going to have to go through screening. Why? What? And why didn't you tell me right away? Versus companies like Amazon that put it right in the ad. If we're going to make you an offer, we're going to make a background check a requirement. The guy's going to think twice about trying it in the first place. The company saves time, and the other makes it clear that it cares who it puts on the team. Now let each listener consider what the elementary logic is in whether if it's hurting the company, or conversely, it actually shows we're thinking ahead.
Roger that. We've kind of started here and we're coming to the conclusion, and we've kind of brought up the fact that, for example, one of the functionalities that you have in there is the ability to involve the contractors or put the onus on the contractors. And also, actually, given the fact that we've got legislation that's evolving, that we've got the Critical Infrastructure Act coming up, NIS2, and actually it's going to keep evolving. What are your plans for the future? Do you have anything that you have in your sites that you should address, or that companies should address in the future, or maybe some new functionality that you guys want to focus on within Scott? Is there anything like that?
There will be for us. So for every company, there is an AI challenge. Me, on the other hand, because I really have compliance in my soul, and it's what feeds me. I probably shouldn't say, but it's been 20 years for sure. So we're really thinking about it a lot. What we want and what we don't want. Our advantage is that we don't really recommend or do reviews. That said, we have a much simpler option, although of course screening and generally HR services and AI are rated as high risk under the AI Act. So we're going step by step. On the other hand, screening individuals, employees, is not the only part of Scout. Just because we have screening for companies and other things there, that can be done. So obviously AI is a big challenge, a big vindication for us, a big simplification. If we get the masking of personal data and things like that right, then from that perspective, I think we have a great use case that we're testing on at the moment. So that's one thing. Of course, the European identity, the European wallet, and the whole portability or reusable identities and things like that. That's obviously the other big part. We already today, that's why I actually said when we have the Scott report, we don't want the candidate to have to go through that again, even if we or another screening company would make money on it, but it's unnecessary. And then it puts more pressure on the organizations that are certifying it anyway, the data. So I would be happy, of course, if we could get the candidates' consent to engage with the CSIS. or the database of the Czech Social Security Administration and verify the data because your employment data is already there. Why can't we get it from there? Why, if I want to verify the guard's qualifications, I have to call the Ministry of the Interior and there's a man at Excel who looks at the spreadsheet. It's just so I would like to, and we have the capability, and we have the technological capability to allow third parties to do this. That is, even though we wouldn't make money on it and we don't need to. But we do want to enable that digitization at some point, and that use of that information for whoever else is using it. The more of us, the better. So that's the other part. And the third, of course, remains, as I say, if it's going to be about, for us, it's much more about that broader evaluation of that context and that information. And that's where AI takes us the furthest. But it's not, as I'm finding or hearing lately. I'm the one, we don't need the screening. I'm the one who always throws that CV or personal questionnaire into ChatGPT, and I'm like, this is how the sweat flows. But that's where we are. That's where we are right now, unfortunately.
Then when a customer is negotiating with you, they ask, and where do you have the data centers and where do you store that data?
But they'll copy-paste it into ChatGPT in between, if that's true, they ask. So obviously for us, yes, the connection, the extraction of the data, evaluation, multimodularity. And we're going to be doing more of that, and I think that's like the biggest part of it, probably in the course of this year. I think we've already got some pilot projects, and that's just that agent approach for AI, where you'll actually be able to plug Scott into whatever your process is. If you've already got one of those, so as an agent, you actually connect through the API, and you've already got that compliance and that guarantee, that governance and that sort of thing around that. So you can actually plug it in wherever you want. So that's probably the biggest thing, that actually Scout won't always have to be the Scout queue. But we're going to take that data, we're going to process it, we're going to put a stamp on it or an electronic seal on it, etc., etc. And actually those companies can plug that into any other process. So that's probably where it goes the fastest. But I've learned that what was yesterday is different tomorrow. So we'll see where that takes us.
Peter, I thought that was a very nice way to end our chat. That what happened yesterday, we'll see what happens tomorrow, or even with the AI, we're very, very fast forward. I thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about it. I do believe that those stories or that whole issue of human security will be perceived a little bit differently. And I do, that if we cut some of the smaller bits out of it, it'll be even more interesting. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that today, and we're 100% continuing to stay in touch, and I'm curious myself to see where it all goes.
Thank you so much. I thank you as well, and thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.